everybody. I'm Mike. I am a big fan of sort of ad hoc discussions as we go. So we certainly will have time at the end of our session today for Q&A. I definitely anticipate leaving some time at the end for that. But as we go, if you have questions, the chat should be enabled. I'm keeping an eye on chat, so by all means, feel free to ask questions as we go, and I will try to answer them before we move too far away from the subject. And I do see some familiar faces in the crowd, so some of this material may be a little familiar to a few of you. If you don't know me, like Nika said, I'm Mike Madison. I'm based in Seattle. I'm a manager on the Acquia professional services team. Prior to that, I was an architect with Acquia and was at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory before. So I've spent a long time working with Drupal, 10 plus years, and I have quite a bit of experience working with government and open source web, both at the lab and here at Acquia. And it was actually one of my very earliest Drupal cons. It might have been my first Drupal con in Denver, where I wandered into a Drupal for Gov BOF and met Kirsten and started getting involved with this group. And I've been an organizer and a contributor or lead on our web team for a number of years now. So if you have not found a group like this in the Drupal community, if you're relatively new to the Drupal community, I definitely urge you to get involved with a regional camp or Drupal GovCon itself, just because it is sometimes a little easier to find your way, to find your people in a subset of the much larger Drupal community. So anyway, let's talk a little bit about what we're going to do today. If you do come across my material on my blog, or if you've ever seen me talk, I spend a lot of time talking about the Drupal GovCon repository and the website. And the reason for that is as a consultant, is somebody at Acquia who builds Drupal applications for our customers. I get to work on some of the biggest, hairiest, most complex Drupal builds in the world, which is really exciting. Unfortunately, because those builds all belong to Acquia customers, I very rarely get to share the technical details of those sites and those implementations with the world. And Drupal GovCon, as much as I love all of the people and as much as I love contributing to that conference, I also love having a place where I get to do what I do every day at Acquia, following best practices, implementing configuration management and Composer, and following a DevOps strategy, and doing it completely in the open. That way I can give examples when somebody's having a problem with whatever thing. I can say, hey, go look at it here. And it is one of the few times in my career that I've been able to be very completely transparent and open with the work that I'm doing. And I take a great deal of joy in that, because I know Drupal is not always easy and DevOps is not always easy. So today we're going to take a look at the technology we use to power the GovCon website. I'm not going to spend a lot of time in Drupal itself. Mostly we're going to focus on how we've set up the repositories, some of the development tools we use, some of the DevOps processes we use. We're also going to talk about how you can use the GovCon repository as a way to sort of empower your own development team and practices. Now, I will say, since we happen to host Drupal GovCon at Acquia, some of the stuff that we're talking about today is using either an Acquia tool or an Acquia methodology. I see some folks from Pantheon on the call. A lot of what we're talking about here does not have to be Acquia specific. So if you happen to self-host, or if you're at an organization other than Acquia, that's okay. Again, some of the approaches we're talking about here today come from an Acquia perspective, but they are not only usable at Acquia. And a friendly warning / disclaimer, we are going to be digging into some code today. I will try to make things, especially the PHP, a little less terrifying if you're not a fan of reading PHP, but we will be looking at some code today, so just beware. Quick question. Mike, can you describe how developers are set up to support CI/CD? Are they running local development? Ray, we are going to get into all of that and more during this session. So I'm not going to answer your question right now, but we do have quite a bit to cover. But yes, the short answer is we are using local development, we are using Acquia pipelines, and we are using BLT. So the Drupal GovCon website actually far predates my time. I saw Adam Weingarten join. Adam was the technical lead for at least a year or two before I joined. And prior to my time on the project, we were running Drupal 7, and I believe that was actually a COD, conference organizing distribution based site, just like the DrupalCon site. And my first year on the project, which I think was 2016, maybe 2015, we actually were a very early adopter of Drupal 8 for the GovCon site. This was really exciting. It was really good, but it also presented some problems because COD was not available and was not stable for Drupal 8 at that time. And we made the jump to Drupal 8, which was great. And we got ahead of COD, which was not great. And what that essentially meant, if you're not familiar with COD is all about providing a platform for managing and operating conferences. So things like user registration, session submissions, schedule generation, all of that stuff, which is baked into COD, needs a little bit of work in Drupal. So there were a couple of years there where we actually sort of built a solution in Drupal 8, held the conference, and then burned it down and started over again the next year with a completely new website. And as somebody who went through that a number of times, as somebody who has seen quite a few folks who participate in our web team sort of burn out and step away, we realized that was pretty unsustainable, just because rebuilding the conference site over and over and over again when you've got a team full of volunteers is that's a lot to ask of your volunteers. So we do have a more sustainable process that we use now. We're reusing the same site every year. Is it perfect? No. Does it work? Yes. And we are also now running Drupal 9. We updated to Drupal 9 after the conference last year. I cannot say we were an early adopter of Drupal 9 just because we intentionally waited until after the 2020 con to do that update, but we are on D9 now. And even though the site is hosted at Acquia, even though I do work at Acquia, everything that is done on the site is done by volunteers. This is very much a government Drupal community endeavor, and there's a lot of folks both on this call and elsewhere in the Drupal community who have contributed to this project over the years. A couple of challenges I just want to call out briefly before we go farther. Again, COD readiness, no shade or shame on the COD team. It wasn't ready when we jumped, and we did that knowingly, so that's okay. Something that a lot of conferences deal with, and DrupalCon recently went through this, if you've been paying attention, branding and rebranding and changing the look and feel of a conference site can be a pretty disruptive exercise. And Carl Kaufman and the other folks who designed the Drupal GovCon conference website have created some just truly stunning visuals for that site. But anytime you rebrand and redesign, there's a pretty significant amount of work that has to be done to update the website. So again, that is something that over the years has created a lot of work for our team. Believe it or not, the Drupal 8 release cadence actually caused some issues for us. For those of you who've been playing along with Drupal for some time, there were some really significant pivots in the Drupal community throughout Drupal 8. Media becoming much more prevalent in core, content moderation as opposed to workbench moderation, layout builder instead of panelizer, or paragraphs, or what have you. And some of those really big features coming into Drupal core was a bit disruptive. Mostly, again, because of this next item, our team time. Since we don't have a full-fledged development team, since we do have a lot of volunteers, since we do have a lot of historical content and data, just doing some of those big migrations to move from one content management paradigm into a new one ended up being a bit of a challenge. And then the last thing, this again is no shade or shame on anybody who is volunteering or has volunteered on the site. Anybody who's tried to go from a Drupal 7 experience into a Drupal 8 or a Drupal 9 experience, there's a pretty significant jump in the skills required and the rigor required to build and operate that site. And a lot of government organizations, so therefore a lot of folks in our government pool, were slow to adopt Drupal 8, or in fact have still not adopted Drupal 8. And having folks who have time and energy who want to contribute to the site, but do not have time in grade with Drupal 8 or experience doing object-oriented PHP or running virtual machines or things like that, that has created a bit of a steep barrier to entry to contribute. And we've done a lot of work over the years, and we'll talk about some of that in the session today of what we've tried to do to simplify that and lower that barrier to entry slightly. So let's start off, and we're going to do a technology overview. So again, this is currently being hosted at Acquia on the normal Acquia cloud infrastructure. When I first came onto the project, we were running Drupal VM. Drupal VM is a Vagrant-based solution. Jeff Geerling has done an incredible job building and maintaining that solution. We heard quite a bit of feedback from our volunteer pool that Drupal VM was challenging and folks struggled with it a little bit. So I believe last year, we actually deprecated Drupal VM out of the code base and we switched over to Lando. And we've been using Lando now, which is a Docker-based solution for, again, at least a year, probably longer. We are using Acquia pipelines for continuous integration. In the past, we use Travis CI because we are using BLT, Acquia's build and launch tools. The jump from Travis CI to pipelines was pretty painless. Different continuous integration tools have better or worse integration, and depending on where you're hosting, each hosting provider has their own preferred CI/CD solution. So again, we're at Acquia, so we're using Acquia's preferred solution. We're hosting our development Get repository on GitHub. For dependency managers, we're using Composer and NPM. We were using Yarn for some time, but we just pulled that and we're using NPM. Configuration management strategy, we're using environment config splits, which we will get into in some detail. And for automated testing, we're using a combination of Behat and Pally. There are definitely additional automated testing paradigms that we could put in place, but these are the biggies, as well as code standardization and validation. Couple other key technologies to call out. Of course, we're using Drush. We were running Lightning, Acquia Lightning, until just a few weeks ago. If you're familiar with Lightning, Lightning is actually going end of life with Drupal 8. If you have not seen the announcements or the information on that, there are a number of blog articles and announcements, both on my own blog and on Acquia's blog. Ron Northcutt did a really nice write-up on it recently. So we have actually swapped over to the minimal profile as our install profile at this point. And I do say swap, there's a whole process with Lightning that you can like uninstall and change profiles, which is normally not a thing that you can do or is recommended to do. But the Lightning team had some really good work and documentation on that. And again, we're using BLT, which we'll get into a little bit. In terms of content architecture, there's a few key things that we're doing. In a vacuum, I don't love that we're doing all the things this way. They work and they're easy to maintain. And again, when you have a volunteer team, a relatively small team, sometimes you do need to architect things in a way that are easy to maintain, even if they're not perfect. So all of the registration that we do for the conference, requires a Drupal user account, and then we just do it through Webforms. The schedule is a session node that's being displayed on a view. Right now, our landing pages are a lot of blocks and view blocks on landing pages. We're going to be moving more, hopefully this year, into a layout builder paradigm. That's the goal anyway, to be more component design-based as opposed to more view-based. In fact, a lot of what I end up doing right now when we switch over to the conference for a new year is recreating views, just kind of updating things to use a new year. It's a bit repetitive, and I'm really excited to do more with Layout Builder. But that is a roadmap item for this year. We're still working on that. If you're not familiar with the site, if you haven't seen it, DrupalGovCon.org. This is still more or less the way the site looked from last year. We have a couple of key pieces of functionality. The biggest and the most valuable is the session submission and the actual schedule for the conference, so you can see who's talking about what when. We are actually talking about using Sessionize this year for the conference instead of doing it in Drupal. That is the same system that DrupalCon has moved to, and we've been eyeing that. So updates coming on that in the future. We do have a session archive where you can go in and see older sessions from previous years. I think we've got most of the last 6 years migrated into the current version of the site. We do have our sponsor listing, which obviously for a not-for-profit, for a free conference, our sponsors, it's a really important part of the site. So we can talk about all the wonderful organizations and companies that support us. And then we do have, just the basic information and announcements and things like that. So even though there's quite a bit here, at the end of the day, it is a pretty simple site as Drupal builds go. There's not a lot of content types. There's not a lot of custom code. Again, we have tried really hard over the last 3 or 4 years to simplify things down as much as possible. Not to maybe filter out valid ways of doing things, not to do things in a cutting corners sort of way. Again, just to make it that much easier for a small team to maintain and to make it as simple as possible for new volunteers to get involved and work. And if you haven't seen the repository, everything that we do on this site is completely open to the public. It is available right now. If you wanted to, you could go fork or git clone the repo. Fork commands, git clone, Lando start, git clone, composer install, Lando start, BLT setup, or Lando BLT setup, and you've got a version of the Drupal GovCon website running locally, usually within 15 minutes. We do not share access to our Acquia subscription or continuous integration, so it is available except for that piece. So you're not going to be able to pull a database or anything like that, but you can get to the code. You can see every pull request. You can see everything that we do. And if you haven't looked at it, I would definitely encourage you to do so, and we'll be talking more about that as we go today. So let's spend a little bit of time actually and look at the repository. This has been an ongoing BLT project for 5+ years at this point. So if you started a brand new BLT 13 project today, you might get a little bit different of a project scaffold and setup, but we're pretty darn close to what you would get out of the box today with BLT. We are running Composer 2. We have worked over the years to stay sort of in sync with all of the sort of current stuff. So again, I just updated us to BLT 13 a couple days ago. We're currently running PHP 7.4. I'm really chomping at the bit to update to PHP 8. But we're not quite there yet. I'm not sure when Acquia will officially begin supporting PHP 8, so I'm holding off on that, but expect to see a blog article on that process hopefully later this year. Lightning has been uninstalled. We are still using some of the Lightning modules for some of the functionality. These will continue to be active and supported by Acquia through Drupal 9's end of life. So there will be some work in the next couple of years to go ahead and deprecate out these modules and get rid of them in time for Drupal 10, which comes out next year. And as you can see, we do have quite a few contrib modules that we're using. some of these probably could go away. You know, better exposed filters is really useful. Do we use it all the time? No. But again, we're trying to use contrib as much as we can, even if it's not the perfect solution. We're trying to avoid doing custom code. So again, sometimes we end up with a few additional contrib modules. The scaffold for the project is kind of the Acquia recommended scaffold. So, you know, our Drupal install is in doc.root. I've seen some scaffolding that uses like the web or some other folder. We tend to recommend doc.root. You can see here in PHP Storm that my config ignore rules are in place. Again, these are very standard for a BLT/Composer project. If you haven't done a lot with Composer, the big advantage of doing what I'm doing right now, and we'll talk more about Composer in a little bit, is that there are literally tens of thousands of files required for Drupal, all of the contrib modules that I'm running and all of their iterative dependencies, you know, in the vendor folder as well. By not committing all of that junk into the repository, and if we actually go out to the GovCon repository, like there is no doc.root core folder in this repo. There is no vendor folder in this repo. Anytime we do a change that requires an update to a dependency, the only thing that actually changes is the composer file, the composer.json file, or the composer.lock file. So like this Drupal core 917 security update that I did a month ago, you know, the only thing that actually changed here is my composer.lock file. You don't have to worry about committing and managing all of the Drupal core files that changed as part of this security update. Composer handles all of that for you. But when you're working locally, when you're hosting, you still need all of that stuff. So these installer paths help Composer know where to put all of the stuff that you're working with. And again, Drupal profiles, themes, modules, etc., all go into the right place. We do have a couple of patches, but any of you who know me, I pretty aggressively avoid patching as much as possible, just because that is one of the things I now have to maintain. And the lower the barrier to entry when it comes to patches, the better. So again, we do have like 2 patches right now, and we've had others. Like if you go look at the Git history on this Composer file, you know, I think link icon, maybe one of the modules we're using wasn't quite ready for Drupal 9, so we had to do, or external link, I think is the one. We had to patch that for Drupal 9 readiness, things like that. But I pretty aggressively avoid patching, and this site's a great example. You can totally get by with very few patches, if any. And that's about it. There's not a whole lot else in the actual composer.json file to see or look at. The getignore file is more or less our stock BLT getignore file. There's a couple of additional things that we added in here for some GovCon specific stuff. But in general, this is more or less stock. We'll talk about why this is so important later on. As I said, this is a BLT project. We're going to get into the BLT config in a bit. But if you're running BLT, if you're ever curious to see how other projects, other folks configure their BLT, have a look. That's what it's here for. Just trying to see what else is going to be of interest today. We'll talk about the configuration management strategy in a little bit. I tend to subscribe more towards the full configuration management approach with like Drush config import, as opposed to the more features-esque configuration management strategy with like a partial approach. So we do have a full config dump here, and all development and changes have to be captured in config. This does contribute to our barrier to entry for volunteers on the project. Not everybody does it that way. And especially folks coming from previous versions of Drupal who are much more used to like the features approach to doing things really struggle with the config. But at the same time, it's just something I'm not super willing to compromise on, given the certainty we gain right? If I do an install locally, if I do an install in CI and I'm doing a complete config management strategy, if the config gets jacked up in CI, there's a really good chance that the config is also going to be jacked up when I try to deploy it into the cloud. Doing more of a partial based solution, you lose that confidence. So I am intentionally making a trade-off of doing something a little harder for contributors to deal with, but in the long run, I feel much safer in terms of testing and platform stability. And is that a decision I enjoy making? No, but I'm going to choose platform performance and stability every time, because a dead website or a damaged website is not a good thing. Yeah, we'll come back and talk some more about the rest of this in a bit, but I think that's a good place to look for now. We do have a couple of custom modules. We are not using a custom profile. The custom modules are mostly some just very basic minor things. You know, there are a few like block plugins. So if you're ever on the prowl for a custom view field, a custom block, if you ever have wanted to do like a custom view access controller, you know, like we've got an example of that. You know, all of the custom PHP that we do gets run through PHP Code Sniffer. So, you know, I know personally one of the things I really struggled with when I was coming from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8, I kept reading about dependency injection. I kept like notionally I understood that it was a best practice, but I didn't know how the hell to do it. And again, there's a lot of examples here of how to instantiate block plugins or views access controllers or custom views fields or whatever you might want to do with dependency injection. So you can, you know, see that in practice and see how to do it, which I would have killed for 6 years ago, but I'm passing it on, so it's here today. Let's jump back into the slides here and we'll move forward a bit. Let's talk about some of the development tools we're using. I already mentioned that we're using BLT. If you're not familiar with BLT, essentially BLT does a few things for you. It creates a standardized project template. So if you happen to be hosting at Acquia, or even if you're not, and you want to have a standard template for how you scaffold and run your projects, BLT is very opinionated, which can be good and bad, but as long as you more or less subscribe to its opinionation, it's generally good. Provides a common set of tools for building, testing, validating, deploying, etc. So I can actually, in my day-to-day work at Acquia, gain immense benefit from the GovCon project. Because if I'm working for a customer and I'm maintaining the GovCon site, and they're both BLT, and they're both using the same technologies, and they're both doing the same updates, and they're both going through the same hoops to do whatever task, if I'm updating GovCon in my spare time and I run into a problem, there's a really good chance I'm also going to run into that problem with my customer's work. If I run into it on GovCon and on my customer's work, there's a really good chance that many of you are also going to run into that problem. So I can write a blog article about it. I can do a presentation at something like this about it and talk about it and use GovCon as an example to say, hey, doing this, you're going to have this problem. Here's how you fix it. And the more common those tools are, or the more communal we're being in what we're using and how we're doing it, the more we can all really benefit from that sort of group approach to problem solving. Automating common commands, we're going to talk about this in more detail in a moment, but this is, I just cannot stress how critical this is. And then enforcing best practices. So, you know, we were talking about dependency injection a minute ago. Dependency injection's hard. You know, I demonstrated at Drupal GovCon a couple years ago, you know, you can write a block in a handful of lines that works, but does not meet best practices. To actually make it conform to best practices, meaning dependency injection, can easily be 10 times the amount of code. You know, it could be 4 or 5 lines total to do it the sort of half-assed way, and it could be 40 to 50 lines of code with dependency injection. If you don't have an architect, if you don't have somebody going through and doing that code review using tools like BLT, Code Sniffer, et cetera, to help enforce those best practices, are a good kick in the butt for your developers to pay attention to those things. Not everybody always cares. And I know some people feel very strongly both ways about BLT. In all transparency, I'm a former maintainer of BLT, and I'm still very, very active in the BLT community. But at the end of the day, my firm belief is that there are common tasks and challenges that you're going to run into when you're building and maintaining Drupal sites. You're going to need to solve those challenges. BLT has solved those challenges, and since the site is hosted at Acquia and BLT is particularly attuned to the Acquia sort of hosting platform, there's no reason to reinvent the wheel. I've seen customers do this stuff with Doxel or DDev or Lando and automate some of it. Cool. I know other hosting companies have automation tools similar to BLT. Cool. At the end of the day, as long as you have something that helps you solve these problems, and hopefully you're not having to build and maintain all this stuff entirely by yourselves, at the end of the day, that's the important thing. So BLT in practice, we automate, as I said, a lot of our common tasks. It manages a lot of our settings and config. I think personally, the one of the most valuable things about BLT is Acquia's Drupal environment detector, which is just so nice. When I'm running things locally, the environment detector can figure that out. If I'm in my pipelines tool, if I'm in the cloud, this used to be built into BLT. It has now been separated out. So even if you're not using BLT, you can benefit from this. But this helps switch between all of my different settings files for all my different environments. This helps activate config splits based on the environment that I'm in. Like, this just does so much to help automate and manage the facilitation of a workflow between different cloud, CI/CD, and local environments. It's huge. Let's talk about a common task. So, this is something we do every time we start working on the GovCon site, right? Like, I just did that security update I shared the pull request for a few minutes ago. So to rebuild my local environment in Lando, I need to make sure I've got the most current dependencies. So that's both a composer and an NPM install. I need to pull down and sanitize my database from the cloud, or I'll do a clean install. Regardless, that's going to be at least one, if not two, Drush commands. Want to make sure that my appropriate config splits are active, and then import configuration after updating my database. I need to compile all of my front-end dependencies and then flush the caches. And in fact, I probably need to flush the caches a few times throughout this process. That's like 8 different commands. And with all due respect to development teams, expecting all of your developers to do these same commands in the same order every time is just not super fair or realistic. And BLT provides a single command, BLT sync, that does all of that stuff for you automatically, which is really useful. BLT also helps a lot with our automated testing framework. So remember, to run automated tests, you need a server, you need Drupal, you need config, you need content. BLT ships with everything you need to run Behat and PHP Unit and Nightwatch and a lot of the basic automated testing frameworks for a Drupal site. Can you do all that yourself? Yes. Again, BLT helps set that up. And while we're talking about automated testing, like, GovCon does a bit. We've got a few examples here of, it'd help if I looked at the right directory, like a few Behat tests. I've been working over the last couple of years to add, some additional automated tests. We've got some. We could always have more, but you can get a sense of what a basic Behat test looks like. We did some work on a session link, basic little tests just to make sure that works. We're also starting to do more and more with Pally. Pally's an accessibility scanning tool. Obviously, as a government conference, we want to be accessible, just because so many of the folks that participate in Drupal GovCon work for organizations that accessibility is so important. We want to present a highly accessible website for our conference attendees and participants. And we have started setting up Pally. we've got more to do here, but believe it or not, just checking these 3 pages, the homepage, the session archive, and a specific session, this has found and caught a number of problems. And in fact, the pull request that I've had open for a while now, messing around with Aqua Search, this actually failed because of an accessibility problem. So, you know, again, even minimal testing can be quite valuable and quite useful. And my hope is as we continue to maintain and build the site, we will do even more with automated testing. And we already talked a little bit about all of these things. Composer, we already talked a little bit about Composer, but just to drive the point home, you know, Drupal 8 and Drupal 9 are best managed by Composer, period. There's a lot of Drupal modules, there's a lot of Drupal functionality that is explicitly designed to be managed by Composer. So if you download the module, my favorite example is the Search API Solar module. The tar version of that module does not come with everything you need to use the module. Using Composer gets you everything you need to use the module. So hopefully you are using Composer. It does introduce a lot of challenges, particularly how do you navigate what is installed where. We'll talk more about that, but the benefits of using Composer, I feel, far outweigh the challenges, assuming you've got all the stuff. So just going back to the code here real quick, you know, all of our modules, all of our libraries, all of our everything is managed by Composer. You know, if I want to update something, you know, we're running Composer update. Typically we do Composer update of a particular package, but we should be pretty up to date unless some new stuff came out today that I didn't notice. We are running Composer 2, which is significantly faster and snappier than Composer 1, which is really, really nice. If you haven't updated to Composer 2, I would suggest it. Yeah, so, you know, a few Symfony and other updates, nothing probably that would actually impact my Drupal site here. This is all just underlying dependency changes, and that's, you know, that's okay. As I mentioned earlier, we're also using NPM in our theme. I want to talk about that real quick. So BLT has these things called command hooks. So essentially what we're doing, and I need to jump into a different file here, but essentially what happens is BLT is actually running my NPM scripts for me as part of some of my other processes. So if I ran a BLT sync right now, you know, part of what this is going to do is it's going to pull down the database from Acquia Cloud. It's going to install my Composer dependencies, although I just made some changes, so it'll have to revert those back. And it is also going to run my NPM installer for me, which is really convenient. So we do have a package JSON for our theme, and we do have a package lock.json for our theme. Now I will say, you know, by and large on GovCon, the only thing we're using NPM for is really compiling our Sass and JavaScript. We're not doing a ton. In fact, I don't think we're really doing any front-end dependencies that are required to run the website. What little bit of front-end stuff is here is really used as part of our build process, and then we just deploy out an artifact. If you're not familiar with the word artifact, essentially, just keep in mind that things you need for development are not necessarily the same thing that you need for hosting a website, right? So, looking at Sass, you write your Sass a little differently than you would write CSS. So when we compile out that Sass into real CSS, this is what your browser is going to consume when you go to a site. This is what your developer is going to write when they're doing the work. So, we use those front end tools to compile Sass into CSS, and then we deploy out the CSS. There's also a bunch of stuff in this is a lot of just random cruft in here, but there's a lot of stuff in a development repository that you may not need for hosting. So the bottom line is BLT helps generate this artifact, NPM helps generate this artifact, and our DevOps process helps to generate that artifact. You know, something I've said before, and I think last year I talked quite about this in my future-proofing webinar, like a lot of this stuff is not that hard if you have continuous integration set up. But continuous integration can be very challenging to set up. So to give you a high-level overview of what we do on GovCon, we essentially use GitHub and Acquia pipelines. We use Lando locally, so work gets done locally. We open a pull request on GitHub, Acquia pipelines runs, BLT is used both in the local environment and during CI to do the same stuff in the same way, in the same order. And assuming manual code review and the automated pipelines process pass, then we deploy out to our production website. And looking at our repository, like you can see, this build failed. I know this one failed because of accessibility. Pally failed. This one passed, but this one has not been merged yet because it's still a proof of concept, and I know it's not actually ready to go, and that's okay. Bird's eye of how we work. A developer gets presented with a task that could be create a training content type, that could be do a security update for Drupal, whatever. That work gets done, open the pull request, continuous integration runs. During CI, BLT more or less runs this for us, installs dependencies, installs Drupal, imports config, creates some test content, executes automated testing against the site. By the way, these 3 pieces or 4 pieces here are incredibly valuable. Can you install Drupal? Can you import your configuration? Does your content create? And then can you run automated tests against that? If the answer to any of those 4 things is no, then that's a pretty good sign that you screwed up something in that pull request, and you probably shouldn't merge it. Manual code review is still a big part of what we do, just to make sure that things are hunky-dory, and then we'll do that merge as CI runs again, and then ultimately gets deployed out into the cloud. I said earlier, switching from Travis CI to Acquia pipelines wasn't a huge deal. And again, the reason for that is BLT has recipes to generate CI/CD files for Travis and pipelines baked in. There are community managed plugins for Circle CI and GitLab. Although as the person who wrote the GitLab one, I'll warn you, it does not work all the way, but it'll hopefully get you started. And there's, you know, other folks out there who have done BLT integrations with Atlassian pipelines. I've got one for Microsoft Azure pipelines that does work. You know, again, using something like BLT or your own other option in your CI/CD pipeline is just really the smart thing to do, right? Because if you're doing a set of processes locally, if you're using the same processes in your CI and deployment processes, if it works locally, if it works in CI, it should also work in your deployment, and vice versa. If it doesn't work locally, it probably won't work in CI, and it probably won't work in deployment. And this is, I think, just really key. You want to make sure that this does align to your hosting config. You want to make sure it's as consistent and repeatable and stable as possible. And really what you're going for is making sure that every time your CI runs, you should have a high degree of confidence in what the result means. If it passes, it should be stable. If it fails, you probably need to go back and fix something. So let's talk a little bit about how all of this helps you. Again, as I said, 5 or 6 years ago, when I was really actively looking at Drupal 8 and Drupal 9, I was going to Drupal cons, I was looking at stuff, and I just couldn't find examples in practice. Like, I understood the basics, but I'm like, just show me a working example. Like, this documentation is really useful to tell me what it is, but how do I do this thing? Well, let's talk about some major changes that have happened in the Drupal community recently. So for instance, when Acquia Lightning announced its end of life with uninstall procedure, I have pull requests in the Drupal GovCon repo that you can go look at and see where I did the Lightning uninstall. the Drupal 9 update, the PHP 7.4 update, whatever. Like a big part of what I do as I maintain the site is, again, those pull requests go in, and I also frequently blog about it. I've got a number of blog articles about the Drupal 9 update process and the Lightning end of life process. So if there's a challenging or major update that happens, since the GovCon site is a real Drupal site, and since we have to also do a lot of that maintenance and updates, you can go look at our pull requests and see how I or other members of the team have handled those significant changes. Also, let's talk about some challenging concepts. So configuration management strategy is a real challenging thing, right? Like, how do we set up configuration management for a Drupal 9 site with environment splits? Well, you can actually go and look at how we've done that. You can go look at our specific split definitions that we use. You can look at our config ignore settings. You can go look at our environment splits and see what config we've put and where. You know, of course, we're using BLT to actually manage and activate the splits. So there's a little bit of hand waving going on there, but you can do it. If you want to see, you know, hey, I'm a new Acquia customer and I don't know that I want to use BLT, but like, how do I set up a pipelines file? Or, you know, I think I want to use Lando, but their documentation's a little overwhelming. You know, how do I set up a Lando file to use? Again, since we're a functional site using all of this stuff in practice, you can go and look at how we're doing it, and you can borrow or steal liberally from all the work we're doing to keep this site up and running. And I hope you do, because, you know, again, I spend a lot of time maintaining, and our team spends a lot of time maintaining this site, not just for our benefit. You know, we want folks in the community to come in and see how we do things to hopefully help you as well. And I did promise that we'd spend some time here at the end doing Q&A and additional discussion. I tried to do kind of a high-level overview and show some of the details, but I'm sure there are folks that have questions. I do go into a lot more detail in some of these topics on my blog, mikemadison.net. And I hope if you don't already follow me on Twitter or LinkedIn that you connect and stay in touch. But let's take these last 8 or 9 minutes and talk about some of the stuff that you all are struggling with, and some of the stuff you want to dig into a little bit more deeply. Go ahead and use the chat if you have questions. Ray, hopefully I answered all of your questions. I think we covered most of that material.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, good. You guys can actually unmute. That's even better. Feel free to unmute and ask as well if you'd like. Can we get the slides? Yes, I will share the slides, and they should get linked off of the YouTube recording when that goes live. It's a good question. You're most welcome. I think what I would definitely recommend, if you are interested in some of the stuff I talked about today, do please go and clone this repository down. You can set up the Lando VM, you can run the BLT commands, you can install all of our config, and you can really sort of poke at this and see how it works. The only thing you're not really going to be able to do, again, you're not going to be able to actually access or run pipelines. You can see our pipelines config, but you're not going to be able to log into pipelines, and you're not going to be able to touch anything with the cloud. So everything else that we do, you're going to be able to, you know, sort of access and mess around with locally on your own. Another question from chat: has anyone used Site Studio and Drupal, and what's the experience? So Acquia has a brand new product called Site Studio. We are not using Site Studio on this project. But you know, the nice thing about using Site Studio is that if you have a team of folks who need to do layout, if they need to make minor changes to components or do any of the things that historically you'd need to like go change CSS or JavaScript or a twig file and then do a deployment, you can do most of that, if not all of that, directly in the UI. It doesn't necessarily alleviate the need for a good configuration management strategy or running security updates or things like that. But it does give a lot of power to building components, managing your design, managing your layout directly in the UI, and it is definitely a cool experience. And if you happen to be at Acquia, you should check it out. Can't find me on LinkedIn. Well, I will link my profile for you. There you go. Well, if nobody has any other questions, I don't want to keep 50 of you sitting around staring. Ray, did you have another question?
Can we use this on what's it called, Docker?
So Lando is a Docker-based solution. So the repo as it stands right now does require Docker to run Lando. If you wanted to use DDEV or DocSol or your own custom Docker image, those are all viable. And you can totally do Drupal development locally with those. And there's a lot of great documentation and examples out there. But the GovCon repo is set up to use Lando.
Are you using this is, my name's Cheryl. Are you using the Aqua Lando recipe?
We're not currently. What we are using is the Drupal, actually, I think we're still running the Drupal 8 recipe. And I actually have a Lando plugin for BLT that we're currently using as the source. I do plan on updating this plugin for BLT to use the Aquia recipe. I just have not done so yet because it is brand spanking new.
Yeah, I'm looking into it. I'm using a D8 recipe as well. Yeah.
Oh, very nice. Yeah, and I think the really cool thing about having that Aquia recipe is it does have some of the like Aquia CLI stuff baked into it already, and some of the other tools that you could install and use to interact with your Acquia hosting sort of already pre-baked into Lando. So you don't have to install that on your host machine and then install it in your VM. It just comes ready to go. My experience with it so far is that it's very similar to the Drupal recipes. It's just slightly tuned. I think Pantheon and a few of the other folks out there also have similar sort of recipes that are just, tuned towards their own hosting a little bit.
Another question I have, are you using the Search API Solar? I'm not sure if Search is used widely in the Drupal GovCon site, but end of life was 12/31/20 for version 1X. And have you updated to 3X or?
I have. So we're not actively using we're not actually using Search right now because the session archive is a relatively new feature, and that's actually what this Search proof of concept pull request is all about. It's getting us ready to use Aqua Search. So the end of life that you're talking about is not an end of life for Solar Search in general. It just means you need to update to the newer version of Aqua Search. So there is a new version of Aqua Search that uses the newer version of Solar and the newer versions of the modules. You just need to do an update to use that.
Okay.
And there should be documentation out on the Aquia site for that. If you have trouble, feel free to reach out to me. And let's see, Adam just sent me a message about there being an end of life for Search API Solar in 2021. And I think that's Search API Solar 1.x. Yeah, so you've got a little bit of time there, but again, Acquia itself also has some end of life stuff going on. So I'd check out, if you're not hosting with Acquia, that's fine. Like whoever you're hosting with, they should have documentation on what you need to do to sort of navigate this.
Yeah, we were with Acquia, so I'll check that out. Okay, thanks.
Awesome. Yeah, and feel free to reach out. I'm Mike Madison on the Drupal Slack. Feel free to reach out to me on any of these channels, and I'll try to get you more information if you can't find it.
All right, great.
Back in chat a little bit, Jacinda asked, is Drupal still the primary software platform for the US Congress? That's a great question. I'm honestly not sure. I don't know if anybody on the call knows. I know the US House of Representatives used to be one big, massive Drupal multi-site, but I don't know if it still is.
Mike, this is Adam. I got a question for you.
Sure. What's up, Adam?
So, one, hi, good to see you. Two, okay, so you mentioned how like BLT can like has all these awesome commands. So can I do the same BLT sync command that I ran on my local on like Acquia? Like, how do I deploy like my config and stuff over at Acquia?
Yeah, that's a great question, and we didn't get into that too much today, but very quickly, what Acquia's hosting does, and my suspicion is that again, most Drupal hosts have something similar, is we have a what we call the cloud hook system, and BLT ships with standard cloud hooks. And what essentially happens here is when you deploy code, so you do your pull request, you merge it, it gets deployed out into the cloud. This post code deploy cloud hook runs. And essentially what happens here, you can see, is this BLT command runs. And we're not going to go down into the weeds too far here, but essentially, if you look at my little example here, you don't necessarily need to do all of this stuff when you do a deployment. The big thing that you need to do is update the database and import the configuration, and that's what the cloud hook does. So when you're doing your run in CI/CD, when you're doing your local sync, you're running slightly different commands, but the important thing is you're doing the same commands in the same order to help make sure that they're consistent and stable, if that makes sense. Does that answer your question, Adam?
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome. And again, a lot of that comes down to making sure that you're running things in the same order. And this comes back to what I kind of said up at the top of the presentation. Like, even if you're not using DLT, like I'm doing a security audit right now for a code base, and they're doing everything with doxel commands. They're not using, they're not doing BLT. But they do have all of their local commands, all of their CI commands, and all of their deployment commands running in the same way, in the same order. That way, when they're doing work locally and doing the deployments in the cloud, there's parity there to make sure that they're all running in the same order. I've got another couple minutes, and I'm happy to hang out if there are other questions. I see there's still like 40 of you hanging out. If you need to go, thanks for coming. I really appreciate you being here. But if you've got some other questions or things you want to discuss, I'm happy to hang out and answer those as much as possible. I also just want to mention, for the few of you that are still here, we are hiring at Acquia. My team's actually looking for a technical architect right now. So if you are on the prowl or interested in a remote position, definitely check that out.
Hey, Mike, it's Shalane.
Hey, Shalane, how you doing?
I'm doing good. So we still have a couple outstanding issues in BLT since 13 launched that I have a PR in, and I know we can't get into all the details right now. I'm wondering if you've got some time that I could tag you later.
Yeah, absolutely. Hit me up. I know Dane is actually out right now, so that could be part of the reason things are treading water a little bit. Yeah, but hit me up on Slack and we'll see if there's something we can do for you.
Sounds good.
Well, hey, I think that's it then, everybody. Thanks for joining, and I hope you have a great rest of your Thursday.
Thank you, everybody. See you next month.